the one thing I can sort of sew between all of us is like this like general feeling like you have to express something. It's like urgent, and you just have to get it out. But you can't really put a name to it. It's just this like feeling, this thought, this distant thing that I think about writing like that you're constantly like chasing after.
Hi, I'm Nick, and I'm joined by Jack Antonoff of Bleachers for the latest in Enemies in Conversation series. How's it going today?
Good.
How's the album been going down on tour so far?
We just did one night, which was pretty amazing. It didn't feel like a first night. It felt, it felt good.
Well, we're a few hours ahead of show 2 at the moment, and there's already a load of people waiting outside, which is a good sign.
Yeah, it's never bad.
What was the starting point for this album? Did you kind of have a set objective in mind?
When I make albums, it's always like I'm fucking around for a bit of time, and then at some point there's this like line in the sand where I start to see it, what it is, and then as soon as I see it, that's when I understand the objective and how I want to express it. But it always comes at funny moments.
I saw in a previous interview you said that each album's kind of like a house.
Yeah, I see them like houses. Like I see like, songs that would be the entry point, songs where lots of people could spend time in, songs that are very personal, like attics or basements, and they're always different houses, and they look different and they feel different. But I guess the overwhelming metaphor is that they need to be something that can be lived in, even if they're a small house or a castle or whatever it is.
How would you say this one's different from the previous albums?
The past, I thought so much about what had happened and what could happen that I kind of found myself smashing back and forth between the past and the future. And something happened on this album. I feel like I kind of like fell out of the sky and landed on my feet. And something about it feels like super conversational. And I don't know, it feels like you're in the room with me or something. I've never felt like that before, and I don't know what prompted it. I've been trying to consider why, but I don't think a lot about why I feel the way I feel. I more just tend to write about it and then let that be the almost the thinking that I'm doing.
That's so interesting that it kind of feels different in that way. And I guess if you're not entirely sure why it was like that, you probably can't kind of consciously try and recreate that kind of vibe again.
No, but I don't think about it more when I'm writing and making albums. I think that I'm just trying to like chip away at this thing, and then when it's done, it's done. So I'm not. Then I get very obsessed with like celebrating it, which is I think what touring is. Think about it like I'm not like a religious person, but I think a lot about like how like people have this like personal relationship to like a god or whatever, and they go to a place and they celebrate it with people. And lately I've been feeling there's a lot of that with the making of an album and then the playing of the shows.
Yeah, no, totally. If we carry on with the like house analogy, I guess when you're building a house, you need to find a point where you stop. You could always continue renovating. Like, how did you know when this album was all finished?
That's where I never struggle with that. I always know exactly when something's done. I don't know why. It's just a feeling, and I just think, oh, that's done, and I always listen to that. But that's a lot of my work is to just continue to reinvest in whatever gut feeling I'm having.
Who were your main musical influences when you were making this album?
Well, that's the thing is, one of the reasons why I self-titled it is because all the influences were just coming from the band. I just sort of stopped thinking about anyone but my band. If
you're making an album, is it kind of distracting to listen to too much other music? Do you have to kind of focus on the stuff you're making, or?
I kind of naturally do. I don't know what would happen. I just I naturally end up spending most of my time with like the tapes from the studio and what's going on. I'm not like averse to other music. Like I don't mind if I hear it or whatnot, but I do find myself sometimes gravitating towards more familiar music that I know, so I'm not thinking about it because I'm doing all my heavy thinking about what I'm making.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask about the song Self-Respect from the album, which has a really interesting chorus. I'm so tired of having self-respect. Let's do something I regret. I was wondering what was going through your mind when you wrote that song.
I think a lot about this version of self-respect as defined by like everyone else in the world. Like it feels like there's like a real like kind of black and white thinking of how to function. And I think most humanity is more in the middle. So I felt like, especially when it comes to writing songs and art, I got obsessed with like the way that like we speak online. You know, it's so definitive. You know, I'm devastated. You know, so sad about this. Blah blah. This is how I feel, and that kind of lives forever in that zone. But most people feel like a lot of pain and a lot of joy, and they're hungry and they do this and they do that. Your mind moves so quickly. That was that whole like Kobe Kendall day that I had held her last kind of loop in my head of like someone I don't know, it's tragic, something stupid, something really personal. Like your brain just moves so quickly that it feels so exhausting to have any version of self-respect that isn't your own. And I think we live in a time when, you know, like wellness is so commodified and the way we treat ourselves is commodified and the opinions we're meant to have are commodified. So it feels like I just feel fucking tired of having anyone's version of self-respect that isn't my own. Or, you know, Nick Cave put it perfectly when he said how, you know, some version of how boring it is to comment on things that are morally obvious. and I think about that a lot, especially when I'm writing.
What is your version of self-respect then? How do you quantify it?
To do what I love. You know, I live my life in the studio and on tour, and that's how I communicate and it's how I feel myself. So everyone has a different version of it. But I think maintaining it as you define it and not as it's defined in a moment in culture is pretty vital to, you know, maintain dignity in our own human experience as more and more of our lives become like other people's reflections. It's really important to reject that, especially as an artist or someone in the public eye. There's so much pressure to toe any kind of party line of thinking, and the truth is I have thoughts that aren't really quantified by any person or community. They're just my own, and so I don't know, I guess be as readable or predictable as I'd be celebrated to be if I were to be.
Are you quite good at kind of zoning out what's being said on the internet? Because as you touched on earlier, it's a place of like massive hyperbole. Everything's amazing or awful. Rarely is anything in between.
No, I mean it's like it's tough because you want to interact with your times even if you don't like your times.
Yeah.
You know, like so it's like I'm very conscious of like how people speak to each other and what's going on politically and culturally and everything. But then I think that's also why I love touring in the studio, because I can just go there. The door shuts and all it kind of goes away. I feel like I'm doing something far more important for myself and for my community in those spaces.
Do you see kind of touring and recording as separate things, or can you be creative when you're on the road? Like
they're pretty separate.
They're separate.
They are. They're really pretty separate, and there's interplay, but they do really function in different ways for me. And I happen to love both, but they're very separate.
So like if you are on a long tour, you're not going to be like sitting down before a show and maybe like fiddling with a song.
I might, but I do find myself pretty immersed separately.
I also wanted to ask about a lyric on Modern Girl where you say, I guess I'm New Jersey's finest New Yorker, unreliable reporter, pop music hoarder. How did those words come together? I love this expression, pop music hoarder.
Yeah.
Because I felt lots of us who love music feel like that.
I just thought that song sort of started to become almost like a Bleachers theme song. And often when I'm thinking like that, I want to take the piss out of myself and my friends. So I just kind of, I don't know, they made me laugh, those lines. and anyone from the area gets it, but to call yourself New Jersey's finest New Yorker is like the height of my version of comedy.
I think I counted that you recorded the album in 6 different cities. More than that in terms of studios, if I counted
Probably
it.
more, but yeah. Mostly, I feel like New York, New Jersey, New Orleans, and Paris were the big tent poles of where I spent the most time.
Was that by design, or was it just the way your schedule came together? Like, do you feel the need to kind of move around?
No, just schedule. I
Really?
can work anywhere, so I just, you know, if my partner has to be somewhere or there's something going on, I don't mind being there and working. Often it's nice. I like being in Paris. I don't speak any French, so I felt like an alien. I just couldn't hear, or I couldn't understand what anyone was saying. Just walking through the city, walked to the studio, was kind of left with my own thoughts because I didn't understand what anyone was saying. So it's kind of nice.
Yeah, I guess that's quite a good way to be creative. You don't have to be distracted by chatting to everyone you bump into or anything.
Yeah, and you're not sort of like poisoned by all the words you hear. So it felt like very like clean and easy to write there.
Obviously, also known for producing amazing songs for so many other artists. I was wondering, if a call comes in to work with someone, how do you decide whether it's a yes or a no? Especially at this point, I guess, where you must be so in demand and you can't do everything, even if maybe you wanted to.
Well, I just try to. If there's ever something that sounds interesting to work on, I try to meet people and then see if you can imagine doing things with them, and then try to, the ability to make something with someone is so like delicate that you could like someone, you could love their work, but it might not work. So it's just very, you just kind of have to try and then be very honest when it happens or it doesn't. And I intend to follow the things where I feel a lot of inspiration and excitement. So yeah, it's all kind of gut feeling. But yeah, it could be a bit awkward if it's not there.
Yeah.
Because you can't really fake it.
I was wondering, say if you're in like the first ever session with an artist you haven't worked with before, and it's not happening, like you're not creatively kind of sparking, can you kind of work through that and get to a point, or do you think that chemistry has to be there?
No, I think it's there. It's not.
Is that really?
Yeah, I don't think it's really fakeable. At least not for me. I've never been able to. If I don't. Yeah, it's almost like in the same process you could find yourself so distressed or in such joy in the same room, and you never want to have. If it's not working, it's kind of like a sacred place. I don't think you should push too hard. I don't think about it like that. Yeah.
If it isn't working, it must be quite an awkward conversation for you and whoever else you're working with to be like, yeah, like we're not really.
I mean, I always find some amount of pride and joy in telling the truth. So if you can hang there, but it's not very often. I've been in that position. I mean, I usually, lately it's been a lot of interesting work with people I've worked with for a while. So, but yeah, I mean, sometimes it's nice to just be like, yeah, I don't, think I'd rather work on this, and you should probably do something else.
Because as you touched on, like writing a song with someone is a very intimate thing. Like you're both having to kind of give something of yourself. Do you feel like being a producer who's worked with so many artists means you have to have a particular kind of set of empathy skills, listening skills?
I don't know. Maybe. I mean, it's hard for me to know because I'm only me, so I don't know particularly like what emotional skills I'm good at because I don't get to witness myself. I just get, I don't know, half the time I feel like, I don't know. It's interesting as I go out and do interviews, I get so many questions about my process, but I don't have good answers because I don't think about my process. I guess maybe at some point if I'm later in life, have a book about all my experiences, which is not really something I intend to do, but like, I haven't, it's not something I think about. So I don't have terribly like interesting answers about what makes me good at the work I do because I'm just doing it. But I don't know. Half the time, most of my memories are joking around a lot in the studio.
It's quite nice memories to have.
Yeah, I always remember the bits above all.
So I guess like I was going to ask like if your process works differently with certain types of artists and others. Like, is it different with a band to a solo artist? But is it always about having gut instinct and reacting in the moment?
It's always about gut.
Yeah.
So there's obviously massive differences, but at the end of the day, the one major similarity is to hear what you hear and recognize when you hear it. Recognize when you have that feeling, that really precious feeling. It's all you're looking for, and it doesn't really matter how you get there. That's the common thread between anything that I do.
Amazing thing happened earlier this year. You became the first person to win Producer of the Year at the Grammys 3 times in a row. Is that something you can ever get your head
Second
on?
person.
Second person. Oh, who was the first one?
Babyface.
Oh, did he win 3 times in a row? I know he's got 4 in total. But
You can't. Yeah, Babyface did it. I only met Babyface where Babyface is.
Yeah, well, is that something you can get your head around?
Not really. I don't spend. I think it's interesting. When you, because I spend so much of my life writing, I really focus so much about where that comes from, and sometimes like any like markers of success or stuff that's like hard to get my head around, they don't really lead very many places. I'm sort of left with like, whoa, so I feel very grateful, but then I also kind of just like my natural reaction, like that whole week at the Grammys, I was just in the studio because like that's where I can kind of think straight. If I was just sort of like hanging out or being with friends or talking about that week, it might just be a lot of like, this is crazy. Like, yeah, it's crazy, you know?
Yeah.
And so I just tend to be, to go back to this place where I can make sense of what's going on. Yeah. It's so I anytime I'm like, have like a whoa moment, I just try to go back to the studio and work on something I'm imagining in my head. So it's a pretty shit answer, but yeah.
You've also produced a soundtrack to the Apple TV series The New Look, which is about French
Nazis.
French designers.
Yeah.
Dior, Coco Chanel. What attracted you to that project? Because it's really interesting the way you've done the music for it.
Well, I had this conversation with Adam Kessler, who created it. He's brilliant. He's made so many things that I love, and we just talked a lot about that time period and these sort of like great wartime propaganda songs and how they were like beautiful and trying to put a spin on it, but in a weird way kind of told the truth through their dissonance. Talked about modern artists making them, finding this line of them sounding classic but new, finding artists. I started thinking about artists I love now who have voices that exist in any time period. That's why, you know, like people like Florence or Nick Cave or Barty Strange or Perfume Genius, there's sort of these like, they don't exist in any time period. And it was, I really loved working on that. It was very inspiring to make those songs. It was a real joy. I like doing things like that. They're sort of like these like, they're inspiring in a different way. These film projects that I sometimes do that feel a little bit separate from having to like rip my guts out on my own records, and then I can just sort of go over here and have a little bit more fun in the studio and mess around with like reimagining a classic song with some great artist.
What was the process for choosing the songs? Because I mean, we've got Florence doing White Cliffs of Dover, Nick Cave does Lovely on Rose, Perfume Genius does What Difference a Day Makes. I mean, they are like they're classics of their era, but they are from such a different time.
Totally. Well, it's a pretty like It's not a lot of music that most people still listen to from that time period.
Yeah.
So I just went through with Adam just sort of all of our favorites from that time and just sort of started to pick ones and different versions. You know, there's a lot that, you know, there's a Sinatra version of this song, that there's also a so-and-so version. There's lots of people were kind of playing the same songs and doing all different versions of them. And picking out the ones that we really liked and starting to make my list of those modern artists that I felt could make sense in this, and then starting to just put them all together. And then once we had an idea, we'd go call, and some people I knew were friends, some people I didn't know. So if it's something like Florence, I just called her and said, hey, we have this idea, doing White Cliffs, and here's how I imagine it, and then we'd talk about it. And then something like Nick Cave, it was, didn't know him, so it was just, I was like, can someone ask Nick Cave if he's interested? If he is, then I would love to get on the phone with him, and then we talk about it, and just talk to people about this time period of, you know, it's about fashion and Nazi occupation of France and whatnot, but what it's really about is creation in the face of horror. You know, creation happens even in the worst times in the world. So that had to be laced in with the feeling in all the songs.
Yeah, I think it's such a cool kind of overarching concept for an album.
Yeah, I really love, they're still sort of trickling out week by week, and I just loved working on it. And I was doing it at the same time as the Bleachers album, and it felt like this like little like escape into another time period.
Yeah, it must have been quite nice to kind of dip back like that.
Yeah.
I've got a quote from you from 2014, which feels a bit mean. It's like reading out someone's school report or something.
I'll go for it.
But you said, to get away from music, I do other music. If I'm producing someone's songs or writing with someone else, then doing a Bleachers song is an escape, and it keeps me creative. Do you still kind of feel that way?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd like to leave my day pretty unstructured, so I just kind of go to the studio and work on what I feel like working on. Because that's where I feel like you're most useful, is if you bring like a level of joy and excitement to something. I don't want to ever work on something because I have to work on it.
Yeah.
And so I try not to, or I don't, because I wouldn't be, you know, so much of my work is about giving the best of myself to something. And I never want to treat it with any kind of darkness of like, I have to be here, because that's not how I feel. I don't feel that way on tour. Even the way I structure tours, I try not to be gone for too long at a time. Yeah. I never want to get used to it. I always want to keep the shock. So yeah, there's truth to that quote.
I feel like
I said it. There better be.
When music is made in a laboured way, you can kind of always tell. I feel like fans will pick up on that if it's a little bit forced in some ways.
Well, the process can be, you can be so labored about how you feel and what you do, but what you actually, the pieces that actually become the songs of the album, those have to be these magic parts that didn't come from that. So often there's labor around it just to get to those bits.
Yeah. You've announced Madison Square Garden show for October. That must feel huge for you. It's such an iconic venue, massive venue, and it's a New York venue.
No, it's really crazy, and so much of my writing is about shadow of the city and being from New Jersey, and Madison Square Garden, if you believe in all this mythology, is kind of artistically the castle on the hill. So it's pretty surreal. A bit like what we were talking about with Grammys, though. It's not something I can like sit around and think about too much. I'm kind of like, okay, guess I'll go back to work. But I like that. I like to, songs and albums and whatnot, like they're often things that someone experiences alone, and then if a lot of people gather to experience them together, that's magical, but I never want to get too far away from just like the person in headphones listening.
Yeah.
So I often end up back there pretty quickly if I imagine like the band's playing the garden, I'm like, maybe just go back.
Well, I guess it must have been somewhere where you went to see a lot of people growing up. So to kind of think like that, you as a kind of a fan, it's kind of, that would be a head fuck.
Yeah, I mean, I have so many of those with people I meet or people I get to work with or venues I get to play or just being in a band or doing these things is such a wild mindfuck of what I dreamed about when I was young.
Yeah, no, I can imagine that.
But I didn't get to be a professional skateboarder. At some point I really had to choose one or the other because I was really skating so much, and then when it was kind of like, well, I'm gonna break my fingers or my arm, so it's kind of like I had this like fork when I was like 13 or 14 when I really just went music. But I could have been very happy as a skateboarder. I really enjoyed it.
Where do you think your urge to create comes from?
I don't know. Never have. I've always felt like really misunderstood, and it was like this like driving, pounding in me. But I don't know why I feel that way. I've had a nice life.
Do you still feel misunderstood?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, most people I know who write do. It's like this like weird search for something inside you that is undefined. It's the one thing I can sort of sew between all of us is like this like general feeling like you have to express something. It's like urgent and you just have to get it out, but you can't really put a name to it. It's just this like feeling, this thought, this distant thing that I think about writing like that you're constantly like chasing after.
And does that always exist on the same level of intensity? It never really goes away?
Hasn't for me. Maybe it will one day. Maybe that's when I'll write that book. My tell-all. But no, I don't know. I think there's this like looming fear that it goes away, but then it just sort of carries on.
Do you feel like you learn a lot about yourself through writing songs?
At times I do. But a lot of times when I look back, I feel like when I'm writing, I'm so like process obsessed that sometimes I look back and then think like, oh wow, that's what I was expressing. I definitely retroactively learn a ton.
I guess sometimes it must take a bit of time as well. Like you might not know instantly.
Yeah. Well, often you write things that you don't know. That's why you write them, because you're trying to figure them out. And I think that's like always a good place to write from. If you're writing something that you're not sure of, there's usually a wealth to get into there.
It's been, I think, 10 years since the first Bleachers songs. How would you say that the band has evolved in that time?
I mean, just kind of like miraculously. It's really crazy to look back, because on one hand it feels like you start to look around. I've had this a number of times in my career, and you realize kind of the rarefied zone you're in. Like a lot of the people you came up with aren't there anymore, and you just sort of think like, wow, yeah, we got something right here, because we keep kind of, yes, it's strange. I have it often when I see people that came up at different times with me, and we're like, wow, we're still here. So it's so amazing and weird.
It must be, because obviously so many musicians never make it, and others have 2 or 3 years where it kind of all pops, and then that's it.
No, totally. I feel that way at many times in different ways of like. But once again, I feel like one of the themes that we keep talking about is like concepts that are too big to like spend too much time in. So I just sort of go like, okay, I guess I'll go, back to the show or the studio.
How far ahead do you like to look at your schedule?
Very little.
Really?
Yeah.
You don't want to know what you're doing in like 4 months' time?
Well, I don't plan. My schedule is a lot less planned than people might think. I try to keep it pretty open. I mean, I like to like book studio time so I can go to the studio or whatever. But I don't want to. I don't like being like too like boxed in. Of I have to do this. I want to see how I feel, and that's good for other people I work with too. So I'm like available and not just there because I'm there.
Just ask one more question. Do you have any particular aims for the rest of the year?
So many. But that's another question that's too big. So I'm sort of like, let's get through the show tonight.
Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Lovely to chat.